Most of us feel like our personality is a fixed thing, that it's just who we are. It feels solid, real. But what if we explored a different idea today? A thought that might be a little unsettling.
So let's begin right there. Is that collection of habits, traits, and preferences we call our personality, is that really the essence of you? Or could it be something else entirely?
Just consider this possibility for a moment. What if this self isn't some static thing you have to find, but it's more like an operating system that's designed to evolve? A system with one primary function: to organize meaning.
To really get this, we need to look at the underlying structure, the architecture of how our minds build a world that makes sense.
And this means we have to redefine a familiar word. Let's set aside the idea of ego as just arrogance. Instead, think of it as this internal architecture. It's the framework that literally structures your experience, your relationships, your whole sense of who you are. And the most important part is, this framework is not fixed. It can change.
And here's where it gets fascinating. This means two people can go through the exact same event, but because their internal architectures are different, their actual experience of that event, their reality, is completely different. This explains so much about how we see the world so differently from one another.
This evolution tends to happen in stages. Early on, the world is very black and white. Meaning comes from the outside, from rules, from rewards and punishments. As we grow, we often move into a stage where meaning comes from our group. Our identity gets wrapped up in social norms, in what other people expect from us. And this really captures this central tension of that social stage. The human need to belong is so powerful that it can easily overshadow the need to be true to ourselves. It just feels safer to conform than to be different.
Now, if you hold that idea for a second, it leads us to a pretty challenging observation about how we develop as adults.
So here it is. A lot of adults build their entire lives, their careers, their families, their identities, while their internal architecture is still fundamentally operating on that need for external approval. And for a long time, that system can work just fine, until one day it doesn't. And this brings us to the inherent discomfort of growth. Because that journey from an externally defined self to something more internal, well, that's where things get complicated and often really difficult. You can see the pivot here. The central question of your life begins to shift. It moves from what is expected of me to what feels true to me. The search for meaning turns from the outside world to your own inner world. It's a huge transfer of responsibility for your own existence. And that transfer of responsibility is almost never smooth. It can feel like the ground is shifting beneath your feet. It often brings a deep sense of confusion, of being lost, and quite a bit of anxiety.
But that feeling of discomfort is actually a sign that something profound is underway. Your whole system for making meaning is being taken apart and rebuilt from the ground up. The old rulebook you use to navigate life, it just doesn't seem to work anymore. And the new one hasn't been written yet.
So let's zoom out for a second, from this personal experience to the kind of world we're all trying to navigate today. This is where that inner struggle connects to a much bigger picture.
If you think about it, our world asks an incredible amount from us psychologically. It expects us to be self-directed, to have high emotional intelligence, to navigate complex moral gray areas, and to make a constant stream of decisions where there's no clear right answer.
So when you feel overwhelmed by it all, here's a different way to think about it. It might not be a personal failure, it could simply be an architectural overload. The complexity of the world is just asking more than your current internal structure was built to handle.
This leads to another really subtle but important point about this whole journey of psychological growth. The truth is, not everyone actually wants to develop into these more complex ways of being. And why not? Because with greater awareness comes greater responsibility. Once you start to see the nuance and develop your own internal code, you can't just hide behind the simple rules anymore. You can't just blame the group. You become solely accountable for your choices. So, how does all this tie in to one of the most common feelings in modern life? Let's try looking at anxiety through this new lens.
What if a lot of the anxiety we experience isn't a malfunction, but a mismatch? A kind of deep friction.
A gap between the internal map we're using and the actual territory of the world we're trying to walk through. The feeling of anxiety is the tension you feel in that gap.
When you see it this way, anxiety stops being an enemy to be defeated. It becomes information. It becomes a signal that your current way of making sense of the world is being stretched to its limit, and that it might be time for an upgrade.
And so that leaves us with a question to sit with. What might change if we stop treating anxiety as a problem to be solved and instead start listening to it and asking what it's trying to tell us about who we are becoming?